Hey, what's good, everyone? It's Einhander here. Wanted to do a quick video revisiting one of our older topics, which was multi-weapon. Pretty much TLDR, when we say things like subject to change in the beta, this is what we mean. So you're probably looking at the screen right now, reading this message. Now, I will say Uber, this individual, is definitely a reputable source on the PSO2 fleet Discord for a while and always comes with information. And it's safe to assume that anything that Uber releases is something that you should take seriously. So that's why I wanted to talk about this video today. So let's look at what the message says and go through what it means. So number one, changes to damage calculations. Multi-weaponing a rod onto a melee weapon will no longer boost rod damage with something like Might 3. This changed from the global CBT. Now, for those who don't know, Might 3 is a melee damage affix or augment. And in the beta, let's say that you multi-weaponed a sword and a rod, you could put Might 3 to increase melee damage and your rod would get the benefit. And until recently, specifically Uber's post, it was believed that was how things were going to be going forward. But now it appears that that's changed and it does have consequences of how you multi-weapon, which at a very high level I'll get into, but of course, a lot of these things we aren't going to know until we kind of put theory into practice. So for instance, taking my sword rod example, if I put Might 3 onto that sword, my rod is essentially neglected. There are ways that we can think about this, and it brings a little bit more light to some of the affixes that we really weren't sure what they were all about, but now, given these damage calculation changes, we can get a sense of why you might think about using these affixes. What I'm referring to is the damage floor or the damage variability augments. So you may have noticed that when you look at your weapons in NGS, they have damage variability. They can go from 70 to 100%, some weapons 75 to 100, and our PSO2 weapons are actually 85 to 100. What this means is, for example, let's say I do 100 damage, and my damage variability goes from 70% to 100%. What that means is that even though my damage is 100, I have a chance each hit to do between 70 and 100 damage. So you can imagine, even though I can increase my power or my damage by, let's say, 3%, so now my max damage is 103, I still have that 30% damage variance. What damage floor or damage variability affixes and augments do is that they essentially shrink the variability. So instead of doing 70 to 100 or 30%, I can reduce that down to 25% or 20%. So while my damage is still 100, my lower damage is now 80, let's say, instead of 70. This looks like is going to be important when we look at multi-weapons that have two different damage types, for instance, sword and rod. Because while I can go for power, such as Might 3, my rod is not going to get the benefit. Now, of course, there are augments that are dual damage, such as strike and tech. But outside of those, it looks like damage floor might be the thing that we want to think about when we augment these type of multi-weapons. Instead of putting 3% power into strike, when I have both a strike and a tech multi-weapon, I can think of how do I control damage variability? How do I ensure that I'm going to do the most maximum damage possible, even if it isn't the quote-unquote max damage? This also gets into things such as crit rate or crit damage. And so one of the things that's different from PSO2 is how crit is handled. Now, I won't get too much into the specifics, but crit is whatever damage you do plus 20% in NGS. This was different than PSO2, where essentially crit just ensured that you were always doing the max damage. So once again, in our example of doing 100 damage, if you had maximum crit in PSO2, you would always do 100 damage. You would not float, it would not vary. So what you can imagine is when we look at these damage floor or damage variability augments and affixes, and we also look at things such as crit rate, while you might not be doing the max damage, you are going to be doing consistent damage, and with a high crit rate, can get that 20% bonus that can do more than going for full power, or at least balance things out. So I wanted to call this just because there was this belief that, hey, all I have to do if I have a sword is just affix might, just affix melee affixes. And from this information, that is likely incorrect. And so I know I had put something out in regard to the beta. It is my responsibility and I need to be accountable for that. And so I'm going to provide these updates to make sure that everyone stays informed. With that said, it's not all doom and gloom, because my example of sword rod that I use, where damage variability affixes and crit rate affixes might be important, we also have to think about, what am I using that sub weapon for? For example, you might have seen one of my latest videos where I'm using wand and wired lance. Wired lance, for the most part, is a utility weapon. I don't intend to use that for its photon arts. I don't intend to use that for damage. Its weapon action and its ability to gap close. Because of that, I'm not really worried about the affixes that might impact wired lance. And so even though it is a tech and a strike weapon with wand and wired lance, I can still focus on my tech affixes because there's really no consequence for a weapon that I'm just using for the weapon action. I just wanted to call that out to make sure that as you're thinking about multi-weapons, as you're thinking about what is the purpose of this weapon that I'm building, what am I going to use it for, that can also dictate how you need to affix. So I want to make sure that it's not, oh, I have a sword or a melee and a tech weapon, I'm always going to have to go for damage variability, I'm always going to have to go for crit rate. That is not necessarily the case. Depending on what the purpose is, depending on what you're trying to do, you can focus on damage. And that's pretty much all I wanted to cover in this video. Wanted to be responsible and cover my tracks. Make sure that everyone understood the damage calculations and the things that have changed from the beta. Of course, if there's any questions, feel free to leave comments in the chat. There's some other damage variability things, but they're not as consequential. And so I wanted to make sure I got this video out when these other damage formulas and calculations come out. I'll let you guys know, especially if it's super important, but this one definitely needed to get into your guys' hands immediately, given the consequences that it has. On more of a personal note, I really did hope that something like this SEGA would have covered. Even though I understand it's a beta and we shouldn't expect anything, they really didn't give us much information, and so we figured it out as we went along. So it's always one of those weird things to where we're figuring out the systems because they're not giving information, and then they switch it on us. I know technically there's no promises being made, but I really hope in the future SEGA understands that a lot of these systems, especially affixing, if we go back to PSO2, are super convoluted and the systems themselves created issues. And so hopefully in the future they clarify these things so that we can start off on the right foot. As many of you who are playing NGS right now probably realize, multi-weapon is not a cheap thing. And so I'm not a big fan of experimenting with such a high cost, even though I know that's the whole point of playing this game for an extended period of time. But I come from the world of user experience. I come from the world of design in my professional life. And it's just one of those things that I wouldn't professionally or personally want to put my users in that position. But anyway, I hope this was informative. Want to make sure you guys stay up to date with the information, especially things that can affect your gameplay deeply. And I'll catch you next time. Thank you.